Okay, so I want to start with a little review, which is always helpful. Make sure we can pick up where we left off and carry forward here. So, first question I'm going to ask you. In the Neolithic period, we're looking at permanent settlement for the first time. Right? People are stopping their migrations, they're stopping wandering around, and agriculture by this point is developed enough that they can stay in one place and produce all that they need to live. Cool? How does that change things? What kind of changes are introduced once people settle in one place?
Social classes are introduced.
Social classes develop here. We had differentiation in jobs before, but we had not had any significant differentiation in power. Right? We had not developed any kind of hierarchies in hunter-gatherer bands. It does not make a great deal of sense. But sharp delineations between social classes here, various degrees of power and wealth are going to develop there. Some people are going to win out, some people are going to lose.
Women were subjectified. There you go.
Yeah, the subjection of women. Women were subjected. Women lost status. Right? In hunter-gatherer bands, there was no good reason for men to dominate women. Why?
They would share their children.
Okay, so the children were raised collectively. There wasn't like a tight sort of like family structure. We didn't, marriage wasn't really an issue. We didn't, people didn't like permanently link up and get their own house because there were no houses. The bands all moved together and lived together, right? And there was somebody else who had one. There was not a comment that fit that. Yeah.
Well, the women did the gathering, so they did like half the
family. Yeah. Men were dependent upon women as well, right? Since women produced literally half of the food supply. Right? So, trying to take control of them really didn't make a great deal of sense. They both contributed equally to the survival of the band, right, and the success of the band, right? So, their work was equally valued, right? Once you settle in one place, though, that changes, and it changes everywhere, right? So, it's something about the basic social structures that humans developed when they settled into agriculture and came up, with certain ideals that went along with that. What's the key idea? What's the key shift there?
The part of property and land that you have gave you the social class that so if you had a most wanted property or land, you were classified as a better individual because you wanted what everyone wanted. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. So the land that you're on, if your land is better, you're going to be wealthier. You're going to produce more, you sell more, you make more, you make more from trade there. You are naturally wealthier. Once there's an idea of private property, the key issue here is private property. When people settled and developed agriculture, people started saying, this is my plot of land to work. Right? Whereas we're all migrating around, we're just picking things up anywhere, it didn't really matter. That kind of possessiveness did not come into it. Once people claimed specific chunks of land here, there are winners and losers. Some people got better chunks than others, and that's really the basis for a slow development of that class system that comes up here, but it also affects women. Because men come up with the idea here, well, I need to secure my plot of land. The best way to control my plot of land is to have my own children, right? That, my own little family, my own little dynasty here, and they're going to help me work the land. A large family suddenly becomes a useful idea. Large families were not really the norm before. And with a large family, I can defend that, and I can pass my property on to a direct heir. Right, and the only way really to guarantee that you have an heir, right? Since women are the ones who give birth, right? And it is a long stretch in between conception and birth. Right? So there's no real way for any male to know if that child is his. Right? If she has slept with someone else in that same month, it could easily be someone else's child. You see how that works there? So you have to come up with customs, laws, prohibitions, right, force when necessary in order to prevent women from sleeping with other people. Right? And that is an important shift that shows up every single place that humans settle in one place. Right? All cultures develop patriarchally. There are a lot of great myths in fantasy fiction and whatnot here. historical fiction about lost matriarchal societies. You guys have heard of like Wonder Woman, right?
Uh-huh.
You know, with the island of, what was it, Themyscira or something like that? There's a whole island of Amazons, right? And the Amazons idea in the comic books actually goes back to a Greek myth that actually probably originally referred to the Scythian peoples to the north, where today like Ukraine is, who did have like women warriors. But that was simply their response to the fact that women had a prominent social role. The Scythians were not an agricultural people. They weren't settled, so men and women were closer to equal, right? So there were women riding on horseback and shooting people, right? And they're like, oh my God, that's so weird. So there's a fantasy then that it's somehow a women-dominated society, right? It was not, right? No settled society was ever ruled directly by women, right? And so it is a significant shift we're going to see everywhere. So those two big key issues, two key shifts we've got here in the Neolithic period: the loss of status by women and the rise of social classes.
You said no society ever in the history of mankind has been, ran by just women?
Correct.
Okay.
No society's ever had legal structures enshrining female control. There have been female rulers.
Okay,
right? There have been tons of female rulers. There have been periods in time when women have risen to power or taken power in their own name. I'll actually give you one example of that today. I'll give you a few other examples as they come up in the course, because there's a handful of interesting figures that show up that way. But that's not the same as like the actual social structures being geared toward it. Right. We're going to talk today about the introduction of the first legal systems in the world, and we can note some examples there where the first laws do enshrine male dominance.
Cleopatra was one of them, right?
She was a relatively late figure too. That's just before the Roman period in Egypt. Cleopatra is only a hair over 2,000 years ago. And yeah, she did rule for a little while in her own name. Initially, she ruled with her brother, and then when her brother was killed off, then she ruled briefly in her own name, and then she became co-pharaoh with her son. So there was still kind of like an expectation that there should be a dude in their picture somewhere, because people sort of expected that. But powerful women, right? Strong-willed women could actually rise to power and rule. Right? It did happen. I'll give you one example later today of a woman who ruled in her own name for 20 years. Right? But again, that's not the same as a society. Right? So I just want to make a note here that the patriarchy becomes the norm in terms of social structures. Right? But is it natural? No. That's the key point I want to at least reinforce here. While the historical record shows us, we do have to, yes, recognize that men have taken over and run, societies, at least up to the present here. That does not mean it's somehow a biological norm that, men are supposed to be in charge. Right? Because we have no evidence of this whatsoever before the rise of agriculture, and tons of non-agricultural societies encountered by literate agricultural societies for thousands of years, and descriptions of them indicating that societies that were not agricultural remained essentially egalitarian between the sexes. Cool there? So the other key issue here to really keep in mind here, and we've been dancing around this and hinting at it because of the social classes and women, the key issue, of course, really is agriculture itself. Right? And agriculture develops slowly. It comes up incrementally. It takes a long time to learn all the techniques necessary, but we finally have enough to kind of move forward here. And throughout that, we're going to gradually increase the size of settlements, from villages to towns to cities. And we're going to talk briefly through that process in a minute here, but I want to start with a term and at least make sure we have a handle on this word. So I'll put it down here. I have tried to use so far societies for what we're talking about. Our earlier hunter-gatherer ancestors had social structures. They had functioning hunter-gatherer societies, so they did have a social structure, basic notions of order, right? Justice, tradition, etc. here, but they were not civilized. They did not have a civilization, right? Civilization is also distinct from the term culture, which I'm going to use a lot in the class here. Culture would be the ideas that we pass on. Right? It could be our language, our religions, our myths, our traditions, our music, our dress, things like that. That's all culture. Culture is also distinct as an idea from civilization. But we tend to, in popular use of this word, squish all of this together. Right?
So you can't. So which comes first, culture or civilization, or can there both be existing at the same time?
Society and culture come first. Civilization always comes afterwards, and did not necessarily occur at all. It's not actually necessary. And we'll run into plenty of places here where it takes a long time to show up in different places, and we'll talk about some of the geographic reasons for that. Because the definition is sort of important for us. I want to throw at you right now what this really means. It comes out of the Latin. It's got a Latin root from quis, right? It basically just means to live in cities. That's it. To be civilized doesn't mean you're like particularly, I don't know, cool or whatever, culture, all this sophisticated, all this stuff here. It tends to imply a lot of that because by the time you reach the scale of a city, and you have that many people living together, generally you have more complex legal traditions, you have a writing system, you've got all kinds of, there's a lot more sophistication involved to give you a city. But the term civilization only means living in cities. The rest of that is all just implied from it, and certainly the kind of value judgment sense that people often use. You're uncivilized, is sort of a tricky sort of proposition. We're going to run into that in several places in the class here where I'll kind of point out why people would have chosen not to build large cities. Right? But we're going to look at the process today of moving into cities for the first time and building up that kind of society. So, here's this. So we're going to talk through the Mesopotamians in our first half today, and then we'll take a break and talk about the Egyptians. Okay. Here's some blah, blah, blah stuff to watch for. What's going to start to set this period apart from what we talked about on Monday, ultimately, is writing. As people move into cities and as things get more and more complex and you have more and more people involved, it becomes necessary to develop certain ways of keeping records. We'll walk through the exact process that it says happens in Mesopotamia here as an example, and I'll give you a few points in other civilizations to develop it, but in less detail. But writing develops for practical reasons at first, right? But once it develops, people start leaving things behind, right? Whether it's a nice piece of literature, a poem, a hymn, something like that, something really cool that tells us a lot about the culture, or something really, really practical like Bob's olive oil, right? Or, an accountant's list, 2 goats, right? A lot of historical records really are just that boring, right? But every little bit of information you accumulate here does tell you something about the way people lived, the kinds of things that were important to them, which feeds into, it expands our picture of them, right? And that gives us what we can call the historical era, right? History is only really possible with written records. History isn't only written records, it has to interpret the material culture as well, everything else that's left behind, the buildings, everything, all the other stuff we can determine there. But written records are key to it. Without written records, we technically refer to that as prehistory. Right? So we were talking about prehistory on Monday. Cool. In looking through this, I'm going to be dealing with a handful of major civilizations in our next few meetings, and a few minor ones kind of like slipped in here and there. The 4 major ones we'll group together as the hydraulic civilizations. And what I mean by major here is not only in terms of scale, but also in their earliness. These are the 4 earliest, the first 4 places where large complex societies developed, large complex civilizations developed.
And what do you mean by hydraulic?
Good question. Something I was just going to ask about too. What do you guys think it means?
They used water.
Water. Yeah, hydro is water. Right? So water. It has something to do with water. What does it have? What about water?
Irrigation?
They'll need it for things like that. They'll need it for irrigation for crops, right? So there's uses for it.
I think they were the first to develop a way to use it for irrigation without using buckets, really.
Yeah, much more complex irrigation systems, building channels, dikes, and whatnot here to kind of move the water around, control water, store water, right? So they're going to get much more sophisticated in their hydro engineering. But what kind of water are we dealing with?
River water.
Water. Drinking water.
Okay, so it has to be fresh water. So we do not build on coasts. Littoral civilizations, coast-based civilizations show up much later, right?
For traveling and trading on the river?
So they'll do that as well. I mean, coast ones can do that as well, but they'll be willing to trade on most rivers. Not all rivers are equally navigable, though. And some of the ones we're going to talk about in these other places, you really can't do that, right? Boats just can't work on them. But moving potable water, moving fresh water, good word too, yeah. Potable just it means fresh water, non-salt water. So moving fresh water is important. So a river, you do not want to build one on the side of a lake or the side of a pond, and you certainly can't build on the coast where it's salt water. Why not next to a lake?
Because it'll eventually...
Hands out.
That standing water creates bacteria and stuff, and water doesn't flow, so it just festers.
Yeah, if it keeps moving, it's actually constantly filtering itself, right? It's running through rocks and whatnot and helping to move some of the impurities out of it. It's also bringing new water all the time. It's not sitting there standing, because people do all kinds of things in rivers. Animals die in them, people urinate in them, bacteria grows, all kinds of things happen in there. And if the water isn't actually moving and being replaced and filtered through there, you're going to suck all that bacteria up, right? So living alongside rivers is the first place where people are really successful. It's not the first place people actually settled, right? Some of our earliest settlements we're actually experimenting with things that we call like dry agriculture, where it actually rains so seldom that it might take 2 years for a crop to grow, and you're entirely dependent upon rain. But people still tried to do that. It took a while to develop the techniques, and that's where I think you brought up irrigation, right? Or somebody brought up irrigation. Those techniques were important in developing those techniques to kind of like bring that into it, and that gives us much more complex civilizations. Earlier ones without the rivers, you had villages, right? Maybe up to a town level. The first places actually to progress to cities, the first places where civilization is born, were all alongside major rivers. Right? Hence hydraulic civilizations. So today we're going to talk about 2 of those. Only day we'll deal with 2 of them together, Mesopotamia and Egypt. And then we're going to talk about China next time, and the Indus River Valley the time after that. So, for Mesopotamia, I will occasionally use the names of some of the other civilizations and cultures in here, but I'm generally not going to try and get you to remember all these different names. Mesopotamia has a very long history, and lots of people have lived here. Right? Lots of cultures have risen and fallen here, different languages have existed here, so I'm trying to deal with it much more holistically as Mesopotamian civilization, make things easier for you. Right? And Mesopotamia, as an idea, it comes from a Greek word for between the rivers, because there are 2 rivers here, both of which were used for agriculture. Initially the Euphrates, much more so for that, but there were settlements along both rivers. And it's part of an overall arc that we can see in the ancient Near East. Now, the reason to start with Mesopotamia in the first place, and then with Egypt after that, is these are the first places where things really take off, right? The earliest river valley civilizations. And we often refer to them collectively, this whole area of the Near East, as the Fertile Crescent, which is a tricky sort of term. First off, look at the shape there. Can you see why they might call it Fertile Crescent? You see the green arc there between the 2 river valleys? So it runs up through Mesopotamia from the Persian Gulf all the way up in toward Anatolia, then comes down here, this area we call the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, and then goes down to the other river valley here in Egypt. Right? Makes a nice little crescent shape here. That area is extremely productive agriculturally. Both of these rivers, all 3 of the rivers here, both these river valleys are extremely fertile, have extremely fertile soil. They're bringing in constant nutrients, flowing down there as they're flooding and dumping in the fresh nutrients into the soil. So it's the land itself is productive. But what's the land like away from the river?
Dry.
It's dry. It's dry as hell, right? This entire area is arid, right? The best parts of it are arid the way San Diego is. You guys know it doesn't rain here very much. You may have noticed that, right? San Diego is an arid climate, right? The Levant is basically like San Diego, right? The place in between there, right? Where you get a little bit of rain here, but you're not going to do a whole lot of agriculture. The river valleys themselves are surrounded by desert. And I mean like outright just sand dunes, desert, like nothing, right? Like Death Valley Desert. Right? Outside of the river valley in Egypt, there's nothing here, right? Occasional scattered oases and massive amounts of sand. So the area as a whole is not terribly fertile, but the river valleys are, right? And that's the key issue here. People have been settling here for a very long time. We have settlement going back here, 11,000 years from those early Neolithic settlements building up here. So there's a steady progression from the Neolithic period into the civilizational period, right? Building incrementally, learning new things. A number of the irrigation techniques that will make Mesopotamian civilization possible are actually developed in the Neolithic period, right? Before there's actually literature. We have evidence, right, before they even have writing, of them experimenting and developing, canal systems and whatnot here, and trying to move the water around. Now, this is a tricky climate, and one of the fun things about dealing with Mesopotamia and then Egypt, and then for you guys in like a summer class here, where it's a long period, we dealing with them on the same day, we can make some interesting contrasts back and forth between them. There are a lot of things that affect both their lifestyles, right? And then from there, also affect their culture, their approach to life, even their religious traditions. Life is much harder in Mesopotamia. Much, much harder. Life in Egypt is good. Life in Egypt is easy. Throw some seeds out there, sit back, man, and sip a beer and let the food grow. There's not a lot that's involved in this. The land just begs to have things grow in it. Right? Mesopotamia takes a lot of work. The key issue for that really is the Euphrates River. It's extremely unpredictable. It floods whenever it feels like it. It can change course, so overnight it can like just shift directions and wipe out your entire village, kill everybody. It's because it silts up. It builds up soils in the riverbed, and then that pushes the river around it, right? So it changes its course. It can also run too low some years, so you don't get enough water out for your agriculture, and it can run too high some years and flood crops and overflow your dikes and canals and whatnot. So it's a tricky place to live in. And there's one key issue I can point to you right from the start about these two civilizations in contrast. Egypt will end up being a very static civilization. It will not change much. It will come to value permanence. Right? This worked for my ancestors, of course it works for me. Because life is predictable there, life is easy there, you don't need to do much. Mesopotamia, because it's a very challenging environment, comes to value innovation. Right? It's a very dynamic place. It's constantly adapting and stealing new ideas, and there's people moving through and exchanging ideas here, and you're having to constantly develop new technologies to respond to actual real-world challenges. Right? So it's a much more dynamic environment. The overall question here about agriculture really and more complex societies when we get to the point of civilization here, there's a kind of, well, what you can refer to as a chicken and egg question, right? What came first? What came first? The complex social order, the sense of like laws and traditions that would allow large numbers of people to live together and farm in the first place and build those canals, or the farming and the canals and the construction there that allowed you to then develop the complex order. You see, the challenge there is that both are actually necessary. If you have one or the other, it's not going to work. If you build up the agricultural surplus, but you don't have a legal system in place to control it, next thing you know, people are killing each other and stealing wheat, right? Everything can come apart, or you don't save enough for the winter and you all die, right? So you need those complex social orders. You need writing systems. You need basic structure to it. But why develop that when you don't have an agricultural surplus in the first place? You see that? Why should a tiny agricultural village develop a writing system and a hierarchical order? There's no reason to at all. Right? So what really happens here, instead of trying to answer the question here, is you have to understand it does this. They go together. They evolve together. Right? Little improvements, small incremental improvements in agricultural output means more complexity in society. Incrementally adding a few new things. Well, we have to make up a new law here. We have to come up with a new tradition or a new idea, right? We innovate a little bit here. And then there's more innovation here, and there's more food, so we innovate a bit more socially. And they build up together, right? So there's constant conflict, there's trouble. This is obviously not, a very quick or peaceful process here, but together, by fits and starts, you're slowly developing the techniques and ideas. Now, let's deal with agriculture itself. and some of the things that are necessary to have agriculture. If you wanted, for example, to grow things in San Diego County, you could still purchase a farmer's almanac. They produce farmer's almanacs for places all over the world here, people growing stuff, and it will tell you at what point in the year and under what conditions you should plant different crops, right? So this is the day of the year that I should plant tomato seeds, right? For them to grow optimally. Right? How do they do that? How do they determine the right date to plant things?
A calendar?
You have a calendar, right? So I've got a calendar I can track it on, but how do I know what's the best time to do it? What's the variation?
The seasons.
The seasons, yeah. That's what calendars are really trying to track in general, right? The whole concept of like weeks and months and whatnot, that's all artificial. We just made that stuff up here. But the basic annual rhythm, the year, that's natural, right? Days and years are natural. They're natural functions. It's the rotation of the earth is a day, the movement around the sun is a year. All right? And because the earth turns on its axis as it's moving around the sun, different parts of the earth get longer periods of sunlight than others at different times of the year. And that affects, when you should best plant. So people are going to have to figure this out. They're going to have to spend time studying the stars and the heavens and figure out how to track time, how to track the seasons, how to track these changes, and start trying to make the best predictions. When should I plant my seeds? Right. Who do you think has time to do that?
Scholars?
Yeah, it's obviously gonna have to be some kind of nerd, right? Because people who have to, be out there working for a living, they don't have time to sit there and, okay, so that one moved a little bit, so, and you're making little charts somehow, you're drawing things in the dirt. No one has time for that, right? So it's gotta be someone with extra time. As we're starting to develop our social classes, if you think about our little pyramid there from, that I said from the Neolithic period on, we're starting to develop a much more stratified society.
The elderly or the injured?
So some elders can often be involved here, and they're the ones who often held the earliest traditions. But as we grow in complexity and there's more and more people, you don't want to wait until a certain number of people get old and come out of other professions. Those people are going to start just training people. They'll pick somebody out. The elders will say, you look talented, come and be an apprentice and learn my craft. And we're starting to develop a whole class of people here. What this develops out of is a priesthood. Right? It's the people who maintained your religious traditions in the first place. Right? You think about how many societies actually reference the heavens in the first place, right? Ascribe some sort of significance to the stars and to what's going on up there. Where often do gods live? Gods live up high. They live up on mountains. They live up on clouds. They're somehow removed from us here, right? That the heavens have always had a sort of significance there to the religious class. So since they're the ones who were staring at it in the first place, they're the ones who start tracking it and coming up with the first ideas. And out of that, a whole social class can develop. Because from this point on, they're no longer just tracking certain traditions and giving you basic advice. Oh yeah, you should totally get married, or basic personal advice there. But now they have a practical function. In a lot of early societies, and Mesopotamia and Egypt alike had this in common. The temple is the most significant part of the economy. It controls the economy in many ways. The priesthood determines when you plant, the food comes in, and the priests track the surplus. They store all the stuff here, and then they pass it out to people. They hand that out in grain. People basically get salaries in bushels of grain or loaves of bread, all right? Because they're the ones who are first able to figure out what's happening and when the best time to plant is anyway. All right, so it basically justifies their existence. So there's a key function here, connecting a priesthood, a formal institutional priesthood, and the economy. And that's a bit new. Religion, as we mentioned last time, is not a new thing, right? Religious ideals have been around for much longer than the time we were settling here. But during the period of settlement, they're going to develop as a very distinct social class with a tremendous amount of political power and wealth. Right? They're going to take in a certain amount of profits. Think about it this way, even if you set aside the temple economy idea as a whole, right? And just think in terms of what you could do. I'm going to say the best time to plant this crop is the 1st of July, right? And I'm gonna tell you guys, on 1st of July, we should all plant our crops here. And I don't, you're gonna say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, I'll do that. And she's like, no, totally, no way, I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna plant on the 10th instead, right? Well, if I was right, your crop is much larger. Do you see how this works? So my social status goes up, right? I suddenly look all cool because I predicted the right time here, right? That's going to gain support of the other people from that point on here. And then because of that, I can say, I get 10% of your crop because I called it. Right? The gods told me the right time to plant here, and they determined that I am supposed to get 10% of your crop, and then I take in that extra surplus there, and then I can use that to hand out, and I can then hire in for building projects. I want a larger temple. I need workers for the larger temple. I will pay you in 2 loaves of bread per day if you come to work on the temple. And people who are unemployed or something, oh yeah, totally, I'll work on the temple, and then I'm hiring people. And again, my social power and status goes up. You see how this works? It starts a little feedback cycle there that slowly increases the power of the priesthood. And this is a phenomenon that we see repeated in a lot of early civilizations. Not all of them, but most of them. And we'll tie that also to the question of writing, but I want to deal with that a little bit distinctly. So I'm going to come back to that in a bit here, but the development of writing is closely tied into what I was just talking about there. But here we're going to develop much more complex social hierarchies. We're going to build on what we saw in the Neolithic period already, and it's going to take off, because it's one thing when you have 2,000 people living in the village. That's already a lot of people. It's certainly more than any hunter-gatherer band could ever have, but it's a big difference when you get to 10,000, right? You're getting like orders of magnitude differences in complexity, so a lot more is involved. So you end up with a distinct warrior class, a distinct priest class, everyone kind of keeping everyone in their place. And the temple, again, plays a very significant role in both social order and the economy. The first of the civilizations to develop in Mesopotamia, to do very significantly anyway, to actually succeed in Mesopotamia, is what we call the Sumerians. And the Sumerian civilization is in the far south. So if you look at a map today of Iraq, you're basically looking at ancient Mesopotamia, but there's a bit more land to the south than there was in the ancient world. Because those rivers, because they carry so much silt from up in the mountains, the actual coastline is pushing farther and farther south all the time, eating up the Persian Gulf. Right? So Ur was actually very close to the coast in antiquity, and today it's several hundred miles inland. Right? So there's a significant difference there. But Sumeria developed in the far south of what was then Mesopotamia. Right? You can see between the two rivers here, here's a bunch of cities here. Sumeria at its start is all the southern part here. And then some of it begins to extend farther to the north, but we'll talk a bit about them a little bit separately here. The common cultural elements. Well, actually, this map shows you pretty well. You see where the modern Gulf is? The Sri land? All this is land today, but did not exist 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. That's kind of cool. But here are our Sumerian city-states. They're going to build up in the earliest period here. Their origins are in a period before writing. We tend to refer to the last stage before the explosion here of Sumerian culture as the Ubaid period, named after a pottery type. And what happens is their culture is developing so effectively because of their irrigation practices, and that they're exporting their way of life to other peoples in the area. So the peoples who already live far to the north of them and have been doing things differently for a long time begin adopting their culture. And we start to see a common cultural tradition develop in Mesopotamia. Despite constant waves of migration, different languages, different cultures that will show up in this area, it does retain a high degree of overall uniformity in its material culture. Right? Even in areas that will later develop different languages and different religious traditions, the basic way of life will stay similar from the Sumerian period on. Right? Now, I mentioned a contrast. And we're going to do this a number of times today. I'll bounce back and forth and make a quick comment about Egypt when we're talking about Mesopotamia. When we're talking about Egypt, we'll go into this in some detail here. Their approach to the gods is fundamentally different from that in Mesopotamia. The key issue for religions in Mesopotamia is fear. The rivers are unpredictable. Right? The rivers make things difficult. The river's surrounded by chunks of desert, so if the river does not work out the way you want, you're going to die, right? It's a very difficult environment to make a life in, and because you might have waves of disease, waves of famine, waves of drought, flooding, that can complicate your life here, what you're trying to do is convince the gods to leave you alone. People do not worship the gods because the gods love you. They worship the gods to convince the gods to leave them the hell alone. Right? And we can see that reflected in the basic perspectives. The earliest Mesopotamians, and then continuing through all the other early cultures that developed there, will view the gods. Did anybody read one of the bonus pieces I put up for this week on the Atrahasis epic? Did anybody see that one? It's not one? There's a part in that talks about the creation of humans in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Why were humans created?
Because the gods were tired of building everything.
Yeah.
They had built everything for so long that they're like, you know what, like we put in a lot of work, let's find someone else to do it. So they built the humans.
Yeah, humans are built for slave labor, right? This is because it takes so long for them to develop all the technologies, because it actually took several thousand years to develop the irrigation techniques that made life in Mesopotamia possible. People forgot it. They forgot how it happened because they didn't have writing to begin with, right? So once you're growing up there and much later, and you do have writing and it's more complex, you're looking around, how did we figure out how to do this in the first place? This is so sophisticated, the gods must have done it. The gods must have told us how to do this. So the idea here is that the gods had initially been the ones to be digging those irrigation canals and building those dikes and controlling the rivers there. They had figured this out, but they were tired of doing this work and they wanted some donkey labor, right? And humans were created to do that, right? And then it goes on to note that because humans breed like rabbits, and there's so many of them that they're making all kinds of noise. The humans are partying all the time, doing all their thing, and Leo was getting kind of like pissed off that he couldn't sleep. These humans are so annoying, and he decides, I'm going to kill them all, right? And tries a few different ways, and finally settles on a flood, a great flood to wipe all the people out, and that, in many ways, may be the origins of the kind of flood myth that shows up. And flood myths are held in common by a number of Near Eastern societies. Right? It's not a global phenomenon here, but it's held in common by a number of societies in the ancient Near East, and picked up by much later ones. Even the Greeks and Romans had a version of this, but only after they had contact with the Near East. But we actually have archaeological evidence of major floods. Right, there's actually a great one where you've got a silt layer in Uruk, I think, it's, I don't know, it's 11 feet high or some crazy thing like that. It's just a massive pile of dirt, mud that had piled in there and completely covered everything, right? Just wiped everything out. The flood stories may be a memory of that, a kind of cultural memory of these times of great devastation. But it also tells you something about the gods, doesn't it? That the gods are capricious, that the gods are cruel. Right, that you have you could be doing everything right. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and the gods just decide to kill you anyway. How would you deal with that, do you think? How could you, as a society, come up with ways to convince the gods not to do it? Sacrifices, yeah. We're going to develop specific rituals, right? Religious rites, ways to appease them. Right? Ways to organize society, regulate worship in a way. If we are all praying in a certain way here, if we're sacrificing in a certain way here, we are appeasing the gods. We're giving them what the gods need. The gods need that kind of prayer energy and those sacrifices, and that will feed them. The sacrificed goat that I give them is food that they can eat. And that will convince them to leave the humans alone. So again, that also feeds into the power of the religious class as well, right? Because they're the ones determining this. So that plays in the same cycle. But this question here of the gods being cruel because the environment is cruel does get into that question of geography and destiny. I'm going to use that term a lot in this class. What I mean by geography and destiny, just to give you the term, and this is a term that's going to be on the little first study guide generally, what it means is that the culture reflects the physical environment. It doesn't mean that people are more successful or not, depending on the physical environment. That's a very different thesis. If anyone's heard of like that Jared Diamonds, Guns, Germs, and Steel, it was like a bestseller for a little while. That's making that kind of argument that where you're living is going to determine the kind of technologies you can develop and how successful and rich you can get. Right? This is a different idea entirely. What this is suggesting here is where you live affects how you view the world, how you see the world, how you understand the gods, how you understand your relation to nature and to other people. Right? And there's a tremendous amount of difference. Peoples who grow up in a desert nomadic culture versus a jungle culture versus living in a river valley, right, are all going to have very different approaches to life based upon the circumstances in which they live, right? And that will affect their approach to the gods. So, let's see. Oh, actually, I did mention here. Yeah. So here's the. It's Spur, not Uruk, right? But yeah, 5,000 years ago, we got a massive silt layer here. And there's bits of evidence of this in several other places as well. We do know that this area flooded regularly, and of course you can see that in the fact that the coastline itself has gradually extended. It is constantly bringing silt from farther up here. So, difficult place to live. Right? Here's a story I was just talking about here in terms of the basic creation. There are a number of versions of this. The one in the Atrahasis epic that I put up as a bonus reading for you guys is actually from an Akkadian version, but elements of the story go back into the Sumerian period as well. So it's a very old understanding of things. And one of the elements that shows up in here is the question here of a flood and a boat. A lot of myths that exist in various cultures around the world here, myths all serve a variety of functions. For a myth to actually be successful, for a myth to take off, it has to be able to be interpreted on several levels. It has to serve multiple functions. Something doesn't stick around as a good myth if it's only good for answering one little question. Right? So good ones tend to be multi-layered. And one of those functions in myth, a common function in myth, is what we call etiology. An etiological function is explaining the origin of something, right? Why do we do things? Why are we supposed to live in a certain way? How did this first happen? Where did this come from? Origin stories, right? And what a story like this can do, a story of like a flood and reset like this, is it actually provides an explanation for why we're supposed to live the way we are. Why are we supposed to sacrifice to the gods? Why are we supposed to follow these particular rituals? Oh, well, to prevent this from happening again. And this is what could happen if we don't do that. It has that kind of element to it. There are other aspects to it. There's moral aspects to it. There's, again, tons of layers to these different myths, but the explanation of origins is an important function of myth.
The etymology kind of almost gives it like credibility. Like, hey, it was like this god's, dad, and his name's this, by providing like a history of the gods that.
Yeah, if you can connect it to like the broader stories of the gods, and especially since you can connect the rulers to the gods. The rulers in the early Mesopotamian civilizations were all priest kings, right? They had a political function and a ritual function. Right? And that connects them into the dynasty. They're the voice then of the gods. They're the ones who intercede with the gods and perform the sacrifices to the chief god of the city. So it gives you a connection to it there. And they're able to pass down, okay, the story, this is what could happen if we don't do this. This happened to our ancient ancestors. We don't want it to happen to us, and therefore we live like this. We have these particular traditions. So, Mesopotamians are going to differ greatly from Egyptians in their approach to what happens when you die. The Egyptians will slowly develop what we could recognize as an afterlife. Right? It takes a long time to get there and still has some distinctions from what some people might conceive of in terms of, in like maybe Christian or Muslim terms of an afterlife here. It is different, but it is much closer to that by the time it reaches its full maturity. The Mesopotamians never get there. A lot of early cultures do have something we can refer to as an underworld. Right? There's a sense of permanence that goes on there, but it's not like a place of punishment because there were no rules to follow that set you up in the first place. Right? That was absent. And it's not a place of reward either. In some places, it's a place of profound terror. Right? It's a place of isolation, of punishment. Stories of the underworld in Mesopotamia have people just crying out. They they can see that there's a world, but they're no longer present in it. They can't touch anything. They're like, no one can see me. It's like you're like a ghost or something, right? Or you're just trapped in a dark place forever, just wailing in a dark room, unable to do anything. Some of the stories about the underworld actually are quite poetic in their awfulness. Right? One of them refers to you as eaters of dirt. Basically, you're worms being trampled by the gods for all time. Essentially, you're not really valuable. You're not valuable to the gods. If the gods loved you and wanted to reward you with some wonderful paradise, why would they make your life suck so much in the first place? So the Mesopotamians have very much a life sucks and then you die kind of ideal here. It takes a very fatalistic and almost pessimistic view of where you're going eventually. Right? Because life is so difficult here, they can't really conceive that it will get better somehow.
Now, did this also consist of where you lived, or did all civilizations and societies have negative,
No, they'll all be different. In fact, I'll give you a contrast today. We'll look at how different Egypt is in this way. We'll talk a lot about the development of the Egyptian religions and how much easier life is there. Gives them an extremely optimistic view. Okay. Right. The relationship between the Egyptians and the gods is much more positive. Right. And examples of negative stories there, like the Sekhmet story of a monster out of control, are serve a kind of etiological function, as we never want to go back to that again, and it's held up as a kind of as an exception. Most of the stories actually have the gods in a very beneficent role, right? As offering good things, as like teaching you things. Here's the god of writing, I'm going to teach you writing, and all these good things come from the gods. And the gods will eventually offer a kind of an afterlife that's actually a continuation, that's not a place of punishment and despair. So what's important here is the environment. Because life was so much harder in Mesopotamia, they develop a more pessimistic view. Okay. Places where it's easier to live are not necessarily going to end up that way. Okay, I mentioned already that the king himself is an intercessor and a priest king. And I mentioned the temple economy, so here's a slide to kind of keep track of that. Right? The way the two are fully interconnected here. Throughout our Near Eastern and Mesopotamian civilizations, the ruler always does have sacral functions, religious functions. To kind of take that forward a bit, let's look at the structure of the cities. Individual cities in Mesopotamia are all going to have a particular patron god. Now the area as a whole will have a shared pantheon, a shared group of gods and stories. Different peoples who migrate into the area will bring some of their gods and they'll simply merge them into it, right? They'll bring along their former chief god will become like the most important god for them, but they'll adopt all the other gods that already exist in the area. So the overall pantheon is held in common, but each of the cities will have its own patron, its own chief god or goddess, right? The one that looks out for that city. And there'll be a central temple built up to that god or goddess in that city, and the king there will then, of course, have the relationship set specifically to that deity, right, and to appeasing that deity. So the construction of temples is going to be important in all of these Mesopotamian cities. And they'll start off quite simply. The earliest temples in Mesopotamia are a platform, just a raised area. Right? Since everyone else is just going to live on the ground, right, and just build your house around the ground, if you build something up on a platform, that's lifting it up above everyone else. It's symbolically picking it up above you. You see how that works? Initially, it's a relatively small platform. But they get bigger and bigger, so they'll get broader and they'll get a little taller. We actually have some places like the Temple of Enki. The archaeologists have actually managed to find 8 or 9 different layers as it's built up, like the earliest points, and they just simply added on to it. And they just kept building and making it bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? Because you're just piling on mud bricks here. And that gives us the beginnings of the chief form of construction for religious purposes in Mesopotamia. That is the ziggurat. Here's a neat picture of a ziggurat. Ziggurats have not actually survived intact to the present day. And you're looking at the picture saying, well, it kind of looks like it, but no. This is actually a reconstruction. Enough of the base of this one, enough of the foundations of the lowest level of the ziggurat of Ur had survived that they fired up new bricks of the same type using the same materials and rebuilt the bottom layer, right? From the framework that they still had, right? So enough of that had survived, but it's not complete. The upper levels, this actually would have gone up quite a bit here. There's steps. So here's a platform, and there's a smaller platform, and there's another platform up there that would have gone up a bit. The upper levels were not rebuilt because we don't have enough evidence to determine how they would have looked. So they kind of left all that undone, but they did rebuild the lower part.
Isn't there like a really, really long way to get up for like the everyday Joe, and just like the priest had a straight way up? Is that...
Most people wouldn't go up at all. Generally, the priesthood were the only ones going up there, but certain people would be able to have certain rituals that would take them up there. But most ordinary people would never actually climb up the ziggurat. Most of this construction here, this is not actually a building. This is solid. This is not hollow. Right? It's basically just a giant pile of bricks, building up a platform, right? And then stairs going up to the top here. Right? So the ways up are the ones that you can see here. Right. This is longer than this step up. Right. This is steeper and shorter, but there's 3 stairs going up to that first platform there. And then as it went up at the top level, there was actually like a room at the very top. And in the room at the very top, you would have a statue of the city's god. Right. And that statue is kind of treated as the god. There's a fundamental misunderstanding many people have about polytheisms, that people worshipped idols. They didn't. No one thought that the statue was a god. They treated it as it symbolically. So they would open up a cabinet, and here's the god, and they would put some food out for the god, and then walk away, and then they'd come back a few hours later before the ants got there and take the food out and eat it, right? But it's sort of symbolically giving it to it, right? And on holidays, you would like put clothes on the statues of the god, and kind of dress it up, and maybe take it for a walk around town. But everyone knew it was simply symbolic, right? It wasn't literally the god. But it was intended to represent the god, for ritual purposes. And its symbolic residence will be up at the top there in the ziggurat. So why build a ziggurat? Why this shape? Beyond the fact that it just is an idea over time from higher and higher platforms, so it took a long time before they reached this shape, the rationalization they had for it, the idea that they developed to explain why do we have a ziggurat here, is that they're kind of mountain-shaped. So let's get back to geography for a second. I'm going to use geography a lot in this class. Southern Mesopotamia is flat. It's just, there's nothing there, right? There's desert all off to the west there. There's rivers running through it, and it's just big, flat nothing, right? In the south, you got marshland and reeds, right? But there's nothing else really there. As you go farther north into Mesopotamia, you start to climb up into hills and mountains. The far north of Mesopotamia is mountainous. The south, where cities first develop, is flat, right? So they don't have stone, so they can't build in stone. So ziggurats are built out of mud brick. What do they have? They have rivers. Rivers have tons of clay along the side, and you just fire the clay, put some straw into it to stabilize it a bit, fire those and make bricks, right? So that gives us a construction material. But what they're doing with the ziggurat is symbolically building a mountain where there are no mountains. Because the idea here is gods would want to live up in high places. Gods would naturally live in the mountains. And if the real gods live high up in the far mountains, if I want to convince the god symbolically to bring his presence down to my city and hang out in my city, I got to build him a cool enough house, to sort of make it attractive, right? Why would God want to be here otherwise, right? You can see this, very, very distant echoes of this, even in the way that some people choose to understand the construction of churches, for example. Building of great cathedrals or nice churches. This is God's house. I want God to, feel that this is an awesome house for him. No one thinks God actually lives in the church, right? He's not like, kipping there on top of the altar asleep. No, but it's symbolic. You want it to feel attractive. You want this to, to feel like this is a good place for God's presence. So we're going to reproduce a mountain, the God's natural home in the city. Cool there? That gives us the basic shape of ziggurats. And there are quite a few of these things. Most of them, again, have fallen completely to ruin, and we only have the basic outlines of the bottom area, not even any built-up area. This is an exception to one. You can see here, this is actually in southwestern Iran, because there's cultural overlap with the area there. It's, at the time, was essentially Mesopotamian culture in the west. And you can see that the bottom level is actually pretty good shape, isn't it? But you can see this doesn't go up as high as it should, and it's all collapsed in the corner here. But you can see it originally was full too, that it wasn't supposed to be hollow. But they collapse, they don't survive. The area there was dry enough that this actually somehow managed to survive in good enough shape as long as it did. Most ziggurats did not survive in anywhere near as good a condition as that. Most of them are simply gone. Right? The fact that they are made out of mud brick is important for that. Many ziggurats in Mesopotamia were continually rebuilt in antiquity. They would not only add to them and extend them, right? Make a bigger layer as the city gets bigger and more important. You just add a whole new layer and it just gets bigger as a whole, right? So here was the original ziggurat. Let's build another ziggurat on top of that ziggurat, right? Because it's a giant solid structure. And they just get bigger and bigger over time. Also, they would deteriorate, right? The bricks would weather, right? They would wear down, so they would be replacing big chunks of them. So there'd be, a new construction project every 100 years or so. They would, replace a layer on the ziggurat. Cool. Okay, so ziggurats. This is just a nice little aerial photo of the archaeological site of Ur, and you can see the partly reconstructed ziggurat there, as well as you can actually see the ruin of the top of the next level up on the top, can't you? Just like exposed, worn down brick area. But the rest here you can see just basic foundations of buildings. Right? A lot of things don't survive in any way intact from the ancient world. We have to reconstruct what a building would have looked like from just the bottom level of a wall. Okay, I want to talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh for a moment. But your first significant writing assignment is going to be on the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the way the chief way that project is going to differ from the regular source analyses you're doing, in addition, of course, to being longer, right, and asking for citations to page numbers, the biggest difference is you actually will have a little bit of background to interpret it. You're not going to be just dropped in the deep end and say, okay, what's going on here? I'm going to talk about the epic a little bit right now, and you also have the introduction in that book to help you out, to help you make sense of it. I'm not going to walk through the whole story. We're not going to do like a whole play-by-play sort of Spark Notes view of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but I'm going to talk through a handful of its major themes to help guide your reading a bit, make it a little clearer as you're going through this ancient poem. You can see, oh, that makes sense. Right? Hopefully this helps a little bit. And let's start with why this is important at all. The Epic of Gilgamesh goes back to the Sumerians. In fact, the word Gilgamesh that we use there is actually from an Akkadian version of his name. The Sumerian for name would actually be Bilgamesh, right, with a B. But the story and its origins is Sumerian. But it's going to be passed to all the later Mesopotamian peoples. The Akkadians will adopt it. The Assyrians will adopt it. The Chaldeans will adopt it. Everyone that comes into this area afterwards will pick up this same story, translate it into their language, and produce copies of it. In fact, some of we have tablets of this in quite a few different languages, fragments of it. Most of them actually, the largest single chunk of collections of Epic of Gilgamesh copies that we have are actually in the Assyrian language, which is a much later northern Mesopotamian people, and it came from a school where people were learning how to write. And they were just, to practice, make a copy of this book. Right? You're just going through it, and so there's like tons of copies of them, including a whole bunch with errors. It's just like the building collapsed, and you've got this room with all these tablets in it. Well, we have tons of copies of this, and we're still finding new ones all the time. You see the tablet there in the picture? Not complete, is it? Big chunks missing. All of the ones that we find do have pieces missing, but you find enough copies of that, right? Of the enough copies of the different tablets. There's like 12 tablets in the entire story that you can slowly piece together the story. We are still occasionally finding new lines. Right, we're still occasionally finding pieces. There was actually a great discovery just about a year and a half, 2 years ago. One of the uncatalogued tablets stolen in Iraq during the looting after the Iraq War. When it was recovered, someone recognized what it was and set about translating it there, and they found an extra line that goes into when you're reading the story of like the cedar forest. When the cedar forest comes up and you're reading there, there's a whole line that's not in that text that will be in a later edition of that. That has Gilgamesh sort of reflecting, maybe we shouldn't be cutting down all the trees. Maybe trees are just kind of groovy. Maybe trees are a good thing to have. right? There's a kind of like environmental message there that like saying maybe we shouldn't cut down forests, right? Which is interesting that that line was not present, but they found it on that tablet. And that's how the story has slowly been pieced together as we keep finding new tablets. Cool there? The reason we had to do it that way is that the story was lost. We did forget about it. There were tons of references to it in other documents. Even Roman sources make references back to ancient Near Eastern stories here, but the epic itself had disappeared from history until it was rediscovered through archaeology. We started finding this. But the archaeology has also told us just how long it lasted and how significant it was. That it passed from the Sumerians to all these later peoples and was translated into all their different languages and spread through the entire area here. And it influenced peoples who aren't actually in Mesopotamia. It had an influence on the Iranians. It had an influence on the Hebrews, right? The peoples who are nearby, right? Were influenced by some elements of this story. So, the story itself, it's the oldest mythic narrative to survive to us. That's one of the other reasons it's sort of like significant as a document. It's the oldest story of its kind in the world. It basically revolves around a king, a kind of mythical king. You know, our Gilgamesh character here, he's a king. And as a king, excuse my French, he's kind of a douchebag. Right? He's not a nice guy. He's a pretty rapey king, let's say. Right? It talks about him going and abusing brides as they're getting married, and just going around beating people up and stealing things. He's not a nice person in any way, shape, or form. That's how they introduce the character to you. And people are crying out to the gods, "Oh, save us from this awful king! He's like making our lives a living hell." So they send him a friend. They send a companion, and that companion is symbolically a beast man, a wild man, right? In a way kind of getting at the fact that nature is, both more violent but also more pure in a way, more pure of heart, right, and more unsullied by civilization. So Enkidu is born and he's raised by animals. He's raised entirely apart from other humans. He doesn't even know he's human. And he has to be encountered and civilized. They have to kind of make him, relatable to people here, but because again he has this wild background, he has a purer heart, and he helps to tame Gilgamesh's bad sides and make him a better person. And the story develops that there's a kind of like a bromance that develops, and they're good buddies, and they go off on adventures and they do things together, and yeah, we're having lots of fun here. And then at one point they piss off the goddess Inanna, Ishtar in the Akkadian form. She's sort of pissed off that Gilgamesh spurned her romantic advances, so she says, "Well, I want to take this guy out." But Gilgamesh had powerful patrons. He was himself a demigod. He was like a third god, one-third god, and there were other gods that watched out for him. So she couldn't kill him. So who'd she kill? His best friend. Yeah, she kills Enkidu. Right? She arranges the situation such that Enkidu will be killed. Right? And there's a whole death scene. Oh, and he's you're dying. Oh, this sucks, man. He's like, and then when he dies, Gilgamesh is totally overcome with grief, and he doesn't know what to do with himself. This is his first encounter with mortality, with the question that things die. I can't control that. I can't stop that. I can't stop my friend from dying. I can't stop myself from dying. I'm going to die. Oh, that's awful. I don't want to die. So what does he do? He goes on a quest for immortality. Right? He decides to try and find the secret to eternal life. He does not want to face this again. Now, there's adventures along the way as he's trying to find the secret here, and there are people who tell him, there's this wise tavern owner, and she tells him, "Don't do it, man. This is a fool's errand. This is a waste of time." And, "Oh, man, I must do it." And he goes on. And he eventually he goes trying to find, in the Akkadian version, a character called Utnapishtim. If anybody cares, Zisudra is the original Sumerian for it, but the version you're going to run into in the story here is from an Akkadian text, so it's Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim had survived the Great Flood. This is a version of the Great Flood story, just like the one in Atrahasis. Again, it's a common story. It's retold over and over in different myths. So this is a version of, instead of the character of Atrahasis, it's the character of Utnapishtim. But it's the same kind of thing. There's a great flood. The gods wiped everything out here. And one of the gods didn't want all humans to die, so they told this dude, like, "Build a boat, man. Build a boat. Save your family." He's like, "Cool, I'll build a boat." And he built a boat, and he saved his wife, and they lived, and they got to repopulate the world. Right? And because they were the ones responsible for repopulating all of humanity, so that the gods didn't lose that slave labor, they were rewarded with eternal life. They were given immortality. So he's looking for them, and he finds these guys. And Utnapishtim says, dude, I can't make you immortal. Like, this is a one-time deal. You're going to die. Everyone else is going to die. And he sets him like these impossible challenges to try and like prove to him that I'll give you the secret if you can do this. And of course he can't. That's the whole point. So he'll eventually leave with this sort of realization that he can't do it, that he can't become immortal, that there is no possibility of it here. And the chief lesson that's coming through here is what that really means. When we talked about the idea of religion last time, as it comes in to sort of explain the unexplainable to people, to try and like give them a sense of purpose in life, we mentioned that different cultures will come and put different answers to those questions about meaning and what happens when you die and all that kind of thing. Some will come up with an afterlife, others will not. This is a non-afterlife-y explanation. What comes through in the Epic of Gilgamesh is there's no paradise, there's no eternal life, there's no wonderful reward for you. When you die, that's really it. You're done. But there is a path to immortality of a sort, and that is your legacy. It's your memory. What memory you leave behind. Do you see how that might be an interesting lesson? Why that might give people a sense of purpose or meaning, right? It plays out on different levels. You can see this question of legacy applying to different people in different ways. So, let's talk about the personal first. Right? On a personal level, how does this story help me? How does this question of legacy help me to be a better person? Well, if I can...
Well, you're about to get into it, right? The explanation of the tell and your legacy.
Well, we're looking at like how this might affect the way you would live. So if we tell you that your legacy is all that you get in terms of immortality, how might it affect your decisions?
It would, better decisions would come about a better person, So you would, instead of being a tyrant, you would go out of your way to help the people that are under you as king, right?
Yeah, well, let's think of the personal one though first. How might it affect your lives, right? Maybe you could say, well, I'm not going to be a jerk to my sister tonight, or I'm not going to like beat that guy up in the bar, or I'm not going to steal anything from work anymore, or something. It might affect the way because you don't want to be caught doing things, and you don't want people to think you're an awful person, and you don't want people to think you're a jerk, And what about when you have your own family? It might affect the way you take care of your kids. I'm going to raise my kids right. I'm going to teach them good morals and good lessons, and they're going to remember me well, and they're going to say, yeah, Liam was a good guy, and Liam taught me how to build stuff and And then stories get passed on, and then they'll be like, yeah, Grandpa Liam was a cool guy, and Grandpa Liam had done this, and he taught me that, and there's a memory that survives in families. You see how that works? I tell stories about my grandfather still. My grandfather's been dead for, 15 some years there, and I still tell stories about him and things that I learned from him, and I would pass that memory on. That is a legacy, isn't it? There's a kind of immortality in the memory of the people who knew you. Right, and what they pass on about you. But most families don't get things written about them, right? Most families were not literate, right? And this obviously is a time before like photographs and video cameras and everything else that can pass on memories. You will be able to videos of like your parents and grandparents can be shown to your great-grandchildren here because they will have cameras. They did not. So the political legacy is a little bit different. The political part, where do I have that? Shows up here in how it changes the understanding of kingship. And that takes us back to the beginning of the story where Gilgamesh was kind of a jerk, right? He was a terrible king. Well, the story ends with him coming back and saying, the walls are in bad shape, the walls here, and like protect my city, and make sure my people are safe. Right? He starts trying to take his job as a king seriously. Right? Because he wants to be remembered. And this introduces an important idea that we're going to see carried on from this point forward. I'm going to get to the concept of writing in just a moment here. Right? So we're basically setting the stage for that. Writing will initially develop for practical reasons we'll talk about here, but once you have it, you start using it for propaganda. I can write, King Liam was a pretty groovy king, and he built awesome walls, and he protected us from monsters, blah, blah, blah. And that's up on the wall, and then people 200 years later can say, oh, this King Liam dude sounds pretty good, right? You can remember something about it. And rulers will continue to adopt that idea for a very, very long time. It will never really go away. Right? I'll give you a much, much later example. Have you ever seen, they remake this story every now and then. Have you ever seen a Robin Hood movie? You know, Robin Hood stories, right? Or a cartoon or something, you know, he steals from the rich and gives to the poor. He's a bandit guy, but he's like a good guy bandit, right? The Robin Hood story is set in the time of King John, right? King John of England, right? And you'll notice I just say King John, not King John the First. Because King John was a terrible king. And King John was such an awful king that no one will ever use that regnal name again. If a guy named John becomes king, he will adopt a different name as king. Because the regnal names are often different than the name you're born with. Right? No one has wanted that name again. No one wants to be associated with him because the memory, the legacy of John is a failure and corruption. You see how that works? That's the memory. That gets passed on. We remember this stuff here. This is true over and over again. You can still see it in our own time. You can see it in the way like certain presidents are remembered. Do I want to be remembered like this president? No, I don't want to do that. And so it affects the way people act a bit. So there are certain political lessons that are taken out of this story and passed on to all the later cultures in Mesopotamia, as well as to neighboring ones in the Iranian plateau and in the Levant. So, cool there with the Epic of Gilgamesh? Got some useful points there. Hopefully that kind of helps out a little bit when you kind of dive into reading the story here as soon as your books arrive. Okay, I want to deal with two technical issues. We're going to talk a little bit about bronze, right? The introducing of the metallurgy, right? The first truly useful metals, and then we'll talk about writing. So bronze is a metal. But it's not a naturally occurring element. It's an alloy. It's a combination of copper and usually tin mixed together. And the precise proportions kind of like vary a little bit here from mix to mix. But mixing the two of them gives you a metal that's easier to work with, right? And is much more effective than just simply like beating on a piece of copper and shaping it, right? Being able to like heat together and work with this somewhat softer, more flexible metal that you can like put into different shapes. Bronze is actually recreated as a technology several times. When the Chinese hit the Bronze Age, they developed it independently. They didn't learn it from Mesopotamians. But bronze is a complicated choice for metal. First off, it's while it's better than what you'd have just on its own, like just using copper on its own, bronze is far superior there. You can make much sharper blades out of it than you can with copper, but it is softer than iron. So when we get to iron and iron technology shows up, and we'll first start talking about iron, I think, I don't know, next week or something. It's either, next week we'll get into that, I think, early next week. When we get into iron and we start to see it, bronze will eventually fade away. But in addition to being softer, it's also much more expensive. Bronze is never going to be useful for most things. Right? Bronze will eventually be replaced by things like iron because there is so much iron in the world. Right? It's a very plentiful mineral. Whereas to make the bronze in the first place, first you need the copper. Copper is less common than iron. Tin is even less common, and tin it's difficult to find. So the existence of bronze tells us, as historians, one really important thing about the ancient Near East, and that is the existence of long-distance trade routes. Because neither of these metals can be found in southern Mesopotamia. Again, just think about this. It's flat. There's no mountains in the first place. What are you mining? You can't like dig into mud and find like, copper ore, right? You need to be digging into rock to get in the first place. So, long distance trade routes. These yellow lines here are all trade routes in the ancient Near East, moving around major goods, among which would be copper. right? Bringing those copper ores. So to get the copper into Mesopotamia, to get it all the way down here to Ur, we need to get it from the mountains of southern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. We need to get it from up here. We've got some copper resources up here. We've got some copper sources here. There's large copper deposits on Cyprus. So there's mining being done on Cyprus. That gets carried across the water here, moves along the trade routes, passes through here, what's in northern Syria, and all the way down through Mesopotamia. That's a long trip for the ancient world. So that brings us in the copper. The tin is even more complicated. This is probably going to be hard to imagine, so I'm going to try and pull. Oh, it stuck the first time. That's a minor miracle. I love that. These things are often difficult to get to stick. So here's Mesopotamia, right? So you can see this in scale. Here's where Sumeria is, and I'm getting my copper from maybe like here, right? So my copper is coming along from here. But my tin supplies, my closest tin supplies, are here. So I'm going to have to cross the Iranian plateau, which is an arid high country here, up into arid Central Asia. And there's resources in Central Asia. There were tin mines in what is today Afghanistan. That's a long trip. Another source for the ancient Mediterranean world here actually was southern England. They picked up tin up here in what is today Cornwall in southwestern England and got it all the way to here. That's kind of crazy, you know? I mean, so long-distance trade routes develop quite early and are pervasive throughout ancient history. And that is actually a major source of the spread of ideas, the spread of cultures, spread of language, you know, agricultural technologies, writing, all kinds of things move from place to place. People tell stories as they're moving from place to place. So it really kind of helps us to see this constant movements of peoples. Right? But these trade routes here also give us another interesting problem. If I'm going to send somebody over a very long distance to get something, right, I need to keep track of it. I need to keep records. Right? Otherwise, you know, what's to stop him from like selling half of it along the way and saying at the end that that's all he had or something? You know, if there's no records to track things with, there's no way to actually make any kind of profit from trade. Right? It gets very difficult. This just fun little joke. The first person in history that we know by name was a record keeper, an accountant. Right? So, isn't that kind of interesting? Right? This guy happened to sign this document that he wrote. So let's throw in the invention of writing. Right? One of our key innovations here of the Mesopotamians. Okay, so as many things, it takes a long time to develop. It builds up slowly. It builds up from little scratches, right? A scratch is like 2 lines this way and 1 line that way says it's Liam's. This is my mark, and I can just tell people, oh, this means Liam. Okay, cool, right? And I've just identified this as mine, right? And from these kind of like primitive beginnings, we slowly develop more and more complex ideas. Because you're working primarily with clay in Mesopotamia, cylinder seals were quite common as an early sort of proto-writing system. This is a cylinder seal. And you see it's you know, a cylinder, and it's carved in there, and what you do is you would roll it across wet clay, and it would leave, you know, a particular impression, right? It would leave a certain design. It would say it's yours. And as I'm making like a jar, this is a new amphora to hold olive oil or wine or something here, and while it's still wet, I can roll my cylinder seal on it, and it's Liam's jar. And from that, we start coming up with much more abstract or more complicated symbols. The writing systems in Mesopotamia, as in most places, start off pictographically. They start off as drawings, right? And so, you know, duck is going to look like a duck, right? But then it gets gradually more abstract from there. Here's an example of evolution in the cuneiform script. You can see along the left column here from our earliest evidences of writing that, for example, a wheat grain looks like, you know, a wheat stalk. It looks like grain. Right? But then it gets turned on its side and looks more like a little arrow type thing, and then it, you know, it gradually just becomes like these, you know, 4 little triangles. Right? It gradually gets more and more abstract as it goes along.
What was the reason for that?
Partly it's the technology, the particular writing techniques you're using. They're coming up with a faster way to write instead of trying to draw things out. You're going to impress into clay using a wedge-shaped stick. Okay. And you're just, you and you're just punching down the stick, and then you just stick it in the oven, and you're done. So it's a much faster way of writing if you kind of reduce the types of shapes you're going to make in the first place. Right? You kind of standardize the types of shapes. All we use triangle shapes and line shapes, and you're just combining triangle shapes and line shapes, the two ways you can press the stick down. Cool. And then another reason for that is over time they want the language to be able to record more types of ideas. Right? It's one thing when you've got a very concrete thing like desk to represent, right? But how would I represent, I don't know, compassion? Right? Well, how do you draw compassion? I don't know what that should look like, right? It's an idea. So you need a very different type of symbol to represent those. So you're going to start introducing more and more. The system we're talking about here in Mesopotamia is used for a very long time. It's a very long-lived writing system. Of course, eventually disappears, but cuneiform. This system is going to be adopted by all of the later Mesopotamian peoples. It's first developed by Sumerians. It's then later used by the Akkadians and the Assyrians and the Chaldeans, and it's adopted by the Iranians for their earliest records. It's used for a long time in this region as a basic writing system. And it comes out in part of the environment. You have ample amounts of mud, so a clay writing system makes good sense. The reasons for it are practical. They're pragmatic at the start. Think back to our temple economy. I mentioned the priesthood plays a significant economic role. So you're all going to bring in your harvest, and I'm going to store it. And I'm going to put down records. I have this amount, I took it from this person, took it from this person, took it from this person, and here's the total that I've got, and now I know how much I've got for the winter. Right? And then all through the non-growing seasons, we can parcel things out a bushel at a time to people to go back and make their bread with. Right? So we can keep track of how much we've got. If there was a problem, if there was a famine, if people didn't bring in enough stuff here, then I have to ration it to survive. If there's a surplus, then there's more to be spent on things. But you see how this works? If we can, the only way for a large city to work and survive through winter periods when you can't grow is to be able to store food and track how much food there is. Right? And from that, they start finding other uses for it. It then applies to long-distance trade. The merchant carrying the stuff, he can't read, but the guy on either end can. So they would put a cuneiform tablet and write up what he's taking with him. There was a kind of envelope they developed out of clay that would wrap around that and could be broken open to take the tablet out. Right? It was it had a softer seal on it, holding it together, and they would send that along with the guy. And at the other end, the seal's broken. They take out the list, and they're like, "There's a goat missing," and I ate it. Right? You can bust the guy for I sold that one along the way, but you know what you've got at the end of it. You see how this works? So practical reasons. Once we have it, they find all kinds of other ways to use it. Calendar systems and predict, for divination. If it rains on the 5th of Av, the king will die. There's all kinds of elaborate predictions that come in here based upon the calendar systems and how they understand what's going on here, and stories of the gods and myths and legends, things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Writing was not invented for things like the Epic of Gilgamesh, though. It was invented to say 5 goats. Right? Much more practical reasons. For anyone who's curious, not really as important, but just to kind of bring history alive for a second. When I say tablet, a lot of people might be tempted to think of like an iPad, right, or one of those kind of things, Galaxy or whatever, the little tablets there, or they might think of like Moses with like 2 big stone tablets, some of like the movies there, Charlton Heston or something, carrying down with a tablet, something like that. Tablets were tiny. They're just like a little tiny thing here. They fit in the palm of your hand. All right, so you go to like great museums of antiquity, like the ones in Baghdad or the one in Cairo. You get great collections of like cuneiform tablets. They're all tiny little suckers, right? So the wedge stick. This is a learning one. You can see it's relatively broad there, and he's working just kind of trying to show you how this works. The scribes eventually get very good. They're very fine tools, and you're producing very, very small marks as you're moving along there. And then these things are fire baked, and once done, they're actually extremely durable. It's why we have so many of these. There are tens of thousands of surviving cuneiform tablets because they're relatively difficult to break once they're finished. So, okay. This is here, just if you're interested, as an example of political propaganda. I'm going to make a point about that in a second here. But I do want to make one quick comment about cuneiform before we leave it behind. This is a difficult writing system. It was used for a rather long time. It was easily adaptable to other spoken languages. You could adapt the symbols to the different languages here. You could, a number of the symbols actually were later given sound qualities, basically not alphabetically, but like in combinations, like a consonant and vowel pairs. Right? They were groups of sounds, but you could kind of like write phonetically in cuneiform. So it's used for a long time, but it's limited by A, depending upon clay, right, and B, having hundreds or thousands of symbols to learn, right? So it's a much more complex system. Not only do you have to learn the ones for all the different phonemes, all the different sounds, you have to learn there were hundreds and hundreds of symbols for distinct ideas that were also learned. So it's more complex. Most people could not read. But it's going to be used for political propaganda. And to get at that, the last topics I want to kind of like hit here in Mesopotamia, I want to walk through the creation of the earliest states and give you an example of early law systems. You guys had to read an early source from one of these things here. So I want to just give you a few quick points here. States take a long time to develop. They are not a natural idea. People living in larger, larger countries did not naturally make sense to a lot of people. Initially, people lived around their villages. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. So it would basically be a city with the area immediately around it needed to support it. So an individual Sumerian city or Akkadian city would be the city, and then the farmland around it and its villages. And that's it. And that's a whole country. So there were a whole bunch of countries in that area. Right? They were all separate. Somebody decided to get the idea, I'm going to conquer my neighbor and try to control that city. That did not work very well. People did fight before, there were wars, but people would generally fight, they would defeat the other city, they would take a price, right? So I'm going to steal some of your grain or something here and then you go home, and that's it, right? The idea of trying to control more than one city took a while to do. You've got people like Luqad-Sagasi as an early attempt there, completely failed there. The first people to succeed at this were actually migrants into the region. Peoples of a Semitic language. We'll talk a little about the Semitic language families later in the class here, but this is an early people speaking a Semitic language, what we call Akkadian, and they migrated into this area and settled near these guys, near the Sumerians, slowly adopted their culture, started building their own cities, and became just like that. They kind of assimilated to Sumerian civilization, but kept their own chief god and their own language. Right? And they're the ones to first succeed in large-scale conquest. The figure here is a fellow named Sargon, sometimes called Sargon of Akkad for his capital, or to make him an Akkadian. And he is the first actually successful major conqueror. He manages to defeat all of the other Akkadians and Sumerian city-states and links them into a single empire. And not only does he manage to pull that off, he passes power to a son. It ultimately comes apart after 3 generations. It doesn't survive long term, but it is the first actually successful dynastic state in that it did manage to pass power over a larger territory to somebody. Cool, there's an idea? But this is difficult because cities are spaced out. You don't have quick long-distance communication, right? How do you keep an eye on who's there? You have to appoint people you trust, and they've got to rule in your name. It's very difficult to pull off, right? This is not an easy thing to do. I wish I had time in classes like this and like the surveys to really kind of get more into detail on some of these things. Like Sargon himself is actually a fascinating figure. He should not have been a king at all. He was a usurper. Right? He kind of like worked his way up the ranks, right? And he worked his way up to be like the cupbearer, right? To the king there, the guy who tastes the wine for you, right? So he poisoned the king and took over, managed to pull it off. So it's an interesting story, but we can't really get into it. The significance of bringing up Sargon, though, is he gives us a concept that is useful for us. And this is another one that often shows up in the first study guides. Heroic kingship is a term specific to Mesopotamia, and it links together the earlier notion of a kind of sacral kingship where the king is like a priest. He has that connection to the gods, but connects it to his military actions, right? As a justification for rule. Because people like Sargon said, I should be your king because I conquered you. It's really kind of circular logic in a way, but it's the basic idea is, I'm obviously much more of a badass than the king you had before, so why wouldn't you want me as your king? Everyone wants a badass king, right? And I clearly won. So it's trying to justify, basically you justify your rule through heroic deeds, through conquest, through military activity. So rulers from this point on in this area will all be generals. They will lead armies, they'll be conquerors, they'll be military figures. If you are not actually fighting, you are not a very respectable ruler in the area. All right, that's an idea that gets picked up from Sargon and carried on from that point on. Here's another fun example if you want to read like a little piece of early propaganda. And one of the reasons I include both pieces of propaganda, and just as a hint, this is often missed on those first exams when people try to define heroic kingship, is one of the ways it works is through propaganda. Because you got to pass around the idea in somehow, right? You got to like justify it. You know, Sargon was a super awesome king who conquered lots of people. You know, I can put the stories down there and pass those stories on, right? And justify the rule there. You'd produce all kinds of other things. There are people who like, you know, produce little commemorative statues, you know, of their conquests and sent them out to people. And there's all kinds of ways you want to sort of memorialize yourself. And this area, this period, is remembered for a long time. You know, as late as the 8th century BCE, people were still looking back to this time here in the 24th century BCE and saying, that Sargon was a badass. We want to be like him. Right? The stories did stick around, so that, you know, it was successful in that way too. Now, one of the later peoples, I told you I'm going to try to avoid a lot of like the names of different cultures, and I won't test you on the names of these different Mesopotamian cultures, so you don't have to worry about them here. But occasionally I try to put the names out here to help with certain other confusions. Anybody ever do like Bible studies? You run into like, you know, the Babylonians get mentioned in English translations of Bible, right? But Babylonian gets used in 2 different ways in the Bible. The same word actually refers to 2 completely different civilizations. The earliest references to Babylonians in like the book of Genesis are actually references to the Amorites. The later ones, the later mentions here are references to the Chaldeans. We'll talk about the Chaldeans on another day, right? So totally different peoples here, but same name gets used for them. Cool there? We won't get into why, it's a complicated story here, but I mentioned here the Amorites for one specific reason only. Only one reason, right? The only reason they come up here, and that is this, right? Which you guys had to read a piece of. So I'm going to put it on my little joke, right? Instead of the notes, and let's see what you guys got out of this source. You guys had to read some pieces of the Code of Hammurabi, right? Who had a chance to take a look at that? Cool, good number of you, right? So, what stands out? What's like a cheap observation that you had, an interesting law, something that you saw in this?
It was basically trying to like lay out, if someone does this one thing, this is what you should do to them. I think I saw one that said like, if you get caught stealing, you should be put to death.
Yeah, it's what we call a retributive legal system, in that there are specific punishments laid out immediately. There's no concept like jail or something. You do something bad, this happens to you. It's like it's a basic consequence of something, right? Something else we saw, another observation we got.
There's some things in there that still kind of pertain to some of the laws that we have today. One of them was about the doctor. If he, you know, cut and a person died, or he took out his eyes, that his hands would be cut off, so he would not be able to work any longer. Mm-hmm. Today, a medical professional can lose their license and never be able to work in medicine again. Yeah. So I kind of related it as a lot of those laws kind of trickled down to current times.
Yeah, maybe the types of punishment changes a great deal there, but the basic idea of trying to get someone to be a good worker, a professional, right? This shows up much later with the formulation we tend to use in modern medicine today. Actually comes from the Greeks. You know, we call it the Hippocratic Oath: first do no harm. And the basic idea there is, if I don't know how to treat this condition, I'm not going to do it, because otherwise I can screw up. I shouldn't experiment on people. That's unethical. Right? And that's an idea we can take all the way back here to the Babylonians, right? And say that they said, if you don't know how to do it, don't do it, because if you screw up, you can get your hand cut off, you can't work anymore, you're no longer a physician, right? So you've lost your status there. So that's an interesting connection there between antiquity and the contemporary world. We do still care about people being professional. There's another good one there about houses. Anybody see the one on houses?
Yeah, it's like building codes. If you don't build it right, and it comes down on someone, depending, you get, this was death to, most of the time it was death.
Death is actually very common as a punishment. I'm sure a lot of you guys noticed that one. Death. Occasionally get a hand cut off, then more death.
A little surprised on that.
It's a pretty brutal legal system here. And I'll ask you guys in a minute why you think that is. So think about it for a second here. But let's come about the building. You can make a connection here to building codes, right? To actually doing good work.
Family practice was in there, as far as taking care of your children and your spouse, and if things weren't doing stuff.
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of bits there about taking care of kids. If you adopt a son into the family, then he is your son. You got to take care of him. There's all kinds of things that deal specifically with your family relations and whatnot here. The house, I think, is an interesting one here. I grew up the neighbor, my mother's neighbor when I grew up. So my neighbor as a kid here, he was a contractor. He worked concrete and brick and whatnot here, and he was terrible. Bob was just a joke, right? He was constantly drunk. He was 9 o'clock in the morning, first beer, and he would drink throughout the entire day. And we find much later, work there, there's these little brick pillars in my mother's, front yard to her little wrought iron fence there. And the concrete is supposed to go in the middle that gives it stability. It was too sandy, so there's not much concrete there, and he filled up space with cigarettes and beer cans. He just threw his beer cans in as he was working. So you could kick these things over if you wanted to, right? Really lousy work. There was a cinder block fence between a wall between the houses, separating the driveways because their driveways touched. And my mother runs a child care center, right? And later, when another neighbor moved in, and Bob's long gone, and then other people bought the house, they decided, let's take this wall out of here. We'll just have a wider driveway. We'll just share it. It'll make it easier, right? So okay, well, let's take the wall out here. So I'm there with my stepdad, and we're looking at this wall, how are we gonna get this wall out of here? Let's just see how sturdy it is here first. And so we both get on either end, and we get one solid push, the entire wall fell over. It's one solid piece. There was no rebar in it. It was not in any way connected. He basically just piled cinder blocks onto the concrete driveway. That could have fallen over and killed kids at some point, right? Bob was a terrible contractor. Bob would have died in Mesopotamia, right? So the reason they're trying to do this here is to prevent things like that, because that lousy work, that lousy construction could have had serious consequences. It could have killed children in my mother's driveway, right? And they're trying to prevent that sort of thing. Now think about death. Why is death such a common punishment?
Because we're talking about Babylonians in Mesopotamia, right?
Yeah.
So they're really pessimistic, and they thought of the afterlife as a punishment because you were there in a field of screaming, or you were tormented by the gods as close to death, and so by sending you to the afterlife gave you eternal punishment forever.
Yeah, so there's this nice one there in the sense that this life is the best it ever really gets. So if I take that away from you, life can seem a little bit more precious when you have a very fatalistic view of eternity that way. So that fits in there. It's not a punishment in the sense of a hell kind of torment there, but it's clearly not a nice place to be. So it does send you to a very lousy underworld there. So that's a good one there. Why else might we kill people?
They didn't have jails or nothing like that.
Yeah, no one invented prison.
Like, hey, just to keep someone in the prison.
Yeah, exactly. If I've got somebody who just killed somebody, why should I pay out from our meager resources to keep him alive? He clearly doesn't care about our lives. Why should we care about his? There's an instant justice idea for it, right? It takes a long time to develop that whole human rights idea, and we should give people a chance to reform and all that. It takes a long time for people to get there, right? This is just quick, instant justice, right? No keeping people around, no fuss, no muss, right? Now the key issue with the Code of Hammurabi as a whole, and the reason I'm using it here, is to show that complex legal systems are necessary for large states. Within an individual city, a king can be the law. He can be the justice himself. He can have it all kind of worked out there. You can come to me, I can solve things for it here. But the more and more people I get, the harder it is. I might have to appoint another magistrate to help me out. And how do I keep him doing the same kind of what if he's is more transparently biased? What if a case comes up and you say she stole my goat, and I'm like, well, I like her more than you, so she didn't steal your goat, and and that's transparently unjust, right? You want to keep them honest, and it gets even more complicated when you have multiple cities. So now you gotta appoint somebody who's 200 miles away, and you want him to follow the same laws as you. So if you spell out the laws exactly, right? You need this amount of kind of witness here, this kind of evidence. If this is proven here, this is the punishment. Period. No wiggle room at all. Right? There was no interpretation at all. Right? Just strictly adjudicating what happened. Boom, punishment. Right? And it allowed for a uniformity in a wider area. So law makes possible larger states. Cool, there's an idea? That's the last big concept I want to hit here. I want to head into a bit of a break. The last little piece that I have connected in this notes here is a little connection, a little piece on the Hittites. I don't generally talk about them in the survey classes here. I want to put them on here for one key reason. For a set of innovations that we're going to make use of next time we meet when we talk about the Assyrians. The Hittites are people up here. So Mesopotamia is over here, you can see. It's up here in Anatolia, what is today the country of Turkey. Right? So it's just a bit north of them. The Hittites are important to history primarily for two key innovations. They're not the first people to truly invent these, but they perfect the use of chariots in warfare. Right? Their army doesn't make good enough use of them, but they figure out the technology for it. Peoples that follow them will make much better use of this in terms of tactics and whatnot, but they will perfect the physical technology of the chariot in warfare, which is going to be a significant innovation for us. Why might a chariot be useful?
You're able to move faster throughout the battlefield?
Okay, so you got the horse, you got the speed, so you're able to move quickly there, right?
It would probably be a more stable platform to shoot arrows.
Perfect,
from.
that's it, right? From horseback, it's a lot harder to throw a spear and even harder to shoot a bow, right? You can do it, but it's difficult and you're not very accurate at it, right? And back with chariot, you're just bouncing a little bit, right? So it's a lot easier to shoot. Cool there? So if I've got one guy driving it and I got another guy shooting, I basically got a mobile gunnery platform. Right? The other key innovation here is iron. They perfect the first process in the Near East for producing iron. They never make effective use of it because they end up collapsing right near the end of the Bronze Age here. But the innovation, the technology, we're going to dive into both of those technologies in great detail next time we meet when we talk about the Assyrians, because they will pick them up directly from these guys. Cool? So that's why they're there. All right, that ends our nice long section here. We're going to talk about Egypt after a break. So let's take like a little 15-minute break until 8.
That's funny. I like that one.
I give a funny story that kind of goes along with that. The first time I was living in Cairo for a while, right? And in downtown Cairo, there's no like traffic lanes and there's no street lights. Right, so it's just like chaos. You know? So at rush hour, when everyone's getting off work, they put traffic cops out, like direct traffic at major intersections, because otherwise we're just going to slow down. If there's a lot of cars, that's hard, right? So I'm stopped here. It's rush hour. There's a traffic cop out there, and he stopped traffic in one direction. And it's zipping along in the other, right? Now coming down the street that's stopped, there's a guy on a bicycle, moving at high speed, with on his head a door, like literally a door. Is balanced on his head, no hands on the handlebars, door on his head. I'm already like, that's pretty gangsta, right? And on the door, piled on the door, is bread, tons and tons of baked goods. You know, so just imagine a huge pile of bagels on top of a door, on top of a head, on a guy who's bicycling at high speed. That's already pretty impressive. Now he's zipping along here, and the traffic is stopped. Can he stop quickly? No, he'd lose all that bread. So that guy zipped right out into ongoing traffic, drove around a few cars, and just kept on going. I'm just like, I mean, that's guts. I mean, a certain level of stupidity too, but guts. So I mean, the photos like this always remind me of that.